Well, my name's Miranda Sage, and we're at Beachside Cottage, which is in San Remo. The history of the cottage is that it was built about 1909 for Thomas Bergen, the local publican's daughter, and when she got married. And once she and her husband moved on, it became one of Bergen's holiday houses that he would rent out. And I'm not sure how or why the Thompsons started to come here, but they were regular renters of this cottage, and then eventually they were able to purchase the cottage from the Bergen family in 1924. Jack Thompson was a dentist, and he and Nora both got the Spanish flu in about 1919 when it went right through society, and they came down here to live in what was their holiday cottage. Betty Mason was the niece of Jack Thompson, and when she was little she was quite poorly, and her doctor told her mother that she should be allowed to run wild for a year. And so when she was quite tiny, she remembers Mum packing up the new Wellingtons and the sou'westers and so on, and getting on the train and coming down here to live in this cottage for 3 months with Uncle Jack and Auntie Nora. Through Betty, we've been able to piece together the history of the cottage. Betty writes about the cottage. My aunt and uncle's house was built on sand. It faced the wild southern Victorian coast, set back about 200 yards from the beach behind a hedge of mirror plants. The sea was visible from the front windows and could be heard most of the day and night. When the tide had gone out, it murmured and sighed like a shell held to the ear. When the strong, cold southerly winds blew up, mostly in winter, the big seas would thump below the house after coming in across the recently exposed sandbars. Following these storms, the beach below the house would be heaped with glistening, slippery banks of kelp and seaweed. Occasionally a penguin or mutton bird, half buried along with the big square pieces of cork from fishermen's nets, would be tossed up. Rubbish left by the human population was otherwise little found. And she talked about the house was invaded by sand. It would grit under the big china jug in the bedroom basin, also of china. It would prickle on the bottom of the green tin bath filled with warmed seawater. After walks on the beach, the sand in shoes and socks was emptied outside the house, but it still made its way into the washing up water, the floors, the hanging cupboards and the seats of chairs. In her writings about the stories and the characters and the people that came through, she said it was just the most wonderful experience. You know, collecting firewood, collecting shells, everything was an adventure. She talks about going to the jetty and having her first taste of lobster, she calls it. And she's sitting on a log in the garden, and they've got a fire and they're boiling up the crayfish. And that was her first taste. And all this foreshore, which is so vegetated now, was quite bare. You could see right through to Cape Woolamai. And so her adventures were a little bit different to what we can do now because of that sparsity of vegetation. The cottage was built in a corner of Bergen's bigger land, and between here and town was the tramway track. One of the interesting things was just on the other side of where our fence is now was a golf course. And the golf course was actually registered in 1922. They used to have sand boxes so that you could put sand down instead of a tee. And they used to have red felt flags to mark the holes. And the cows used to eat them. And between the cottage and the main street, there was just swamp. And there was the cow bales where the Bergens used to keep their cows, and they used to go there for milk. So it was quite a different landscape. And then at Bergen's store, interesting, they used to have to wait for someone to come and serve. And if one of the Bergen's daughters came into the shop and they wanted to buy butter, and she said, no, I can't sell you butter because I've been filling the lamps. So her hands would be covered with kerosene. So she had to go and get another sister. But it was quite common just to sit outside, and it was always a big wait at the store. During the war, the officers were billeted, but the soldiers, the also-rans, they were camping in the tea tree here. This was actually a vantage point to watch for invaders and so on. Well, the artist community was very interesting. There's two connections. There's the Max Meldrum group of artists, which includes the one that's most famous is Clara Speckett, and they used to camp in the tea tree adjacent to this cottage because there'd be a lot of bathing naked in the sea and all sorts of goings on, and there'd be the eyebrows raised in the community about these activities. But the other group of people that integrated with that were the Montsalvat people, Justice Jorgensen and his mob. And there were lots of stories about the activities. And a couple of the artists had little trolleys so they could move their easels around. And one or two of them eventually built little caravans that they could travel in with their art supplies. Most of my research and interest has been based on Betty's stories. We've been so privileged to hear her voice, but I know there are many other stories that we have not yet discovered, and we're still learning and following up, and that's the exciting part about this.